The EU Anti-Racism Action Plan is quite a significant departure in policy, or at least in policy language for the EU. We were quite pleased to see that this plan makes explicit mention of institutional racism as a root cause of discrimination. Until now, the EU has tended to view racism through the perspective of the individual rather than as a systemic problem. And I mean, I was 7 years old when the Macpherson report came out in the UK. So it's been more than 20 years now since institutional racism was named, was investigated, and was accepted in Europe. But Europe has demonstrated a minimalist understanding of structural racism in the decades since. Racism is not some form of nature, it's a system which is maintained. Yet, just last week, the Slovenian Minister of Foreign Affairs, speaking on behalf of the Council of the EU, closed the plenary debate on police brutality against Roma by saying that police violence is not a structural problem in Europe. We seem to be slow learners in coming around to this idea of institutional racism. Nonetheless, this action plan in that sense is better 22 years late than never. However, we're concerned it is still another policy document that lacks funding conditionality. Like the new Roma framework and the framework that came before that, it does little to oblige member states to implement its recommendations. There's a fundamental disconnect between notions of equality and democracy in Brussels and the reality in many member states. While we have EU funding continuing to be pumped into projects designed as Roma inclusion activities, this funding is often either outright stolen, misspent, or else sometimes actually used to worsen the marginalization of Romani communities. We have in Bulgaria, EU funding is being spent on police training to recognize radicalization within Romani communities. In Hungary, EU funds are being used to demolish Roma houses in Nyíregyháza, move families who are living there to an even more segregated community, and then evict the people that they were there to replace. The fault lies here with national authorities, of course, but with funding conditionality and better monitoring, this could be addressed better. While the action plan does conceive of institutional racism at its core, the only mechanism it really names for enforcing anti-racism commitments is the Racial Equality Directive. This is a mechanism which has not only proved to be ineffective and lacking in scope when it comes to protecting the rights of Roma, but by definition, this is a mechanism which treats racism from an individual perspective, the perspective of a consumer. If this is the EU's only card that it can pull for fighting racism and promoting the commitments laid out in this action plan will fail. This is not necessarily the mechanism by which to fight structural racism. It's been, 7 years now since the first of 3 infringement procedures for school segregation against Roma were launched. What meaningful change has there been for Romani children in those countries since? The action plan also doesn't quite commit to, but at least considers the need for new legislation to strengthen the role of equality bodies in member states. These bodies, of course, have wildly different powers between countries, but even those with the power to make binding decisions are still by nature operating on the basis of individual complaints. There needs to be a complete rethink of how we approach structural racism in Europe. Addressing structural racism requires structural solutions, not just tackling problems of discrimination in services. Yes, we need a clear timeline for implementing the anti-racist action plan. Yes, we need measurable targets and indicators. We need to look at NEET rates over a 5-year period, as well as a dedicated monitoring mechanism. But structural racism goes hand in hand with anti-austerity policies, with measures to counteract inequalities which are based on class and social background, which are exacerbated by issues of racism. Recognition of the problem is the first step, and this action plan does go some way towards that. But without redistribution, structural racism cannot realistically be tackled. This can be done through things like provision of services, living wages, access to childcare, investing in mental health services, these quite basic democratic norms which society needs to function equitably. They must simultaneously be resourced alongside any measures to implement an anti-racist agenda. Simply put, we need to think bigger, we need new legislation. We need to consider how we fund anti-racist measures and especially how we monitor them in order to address what is an embedded culture of racism in Europe, which blights the lives of millions of EU citizens. Thank you very much.